I'm Sienna. I'm the kid.
I'm Sarah. I'm the mom.
This is Queer Kid Straight Mom.
Let's talk. Welcome back to Queer Kid Straight Mom. Today, we are talking about protests, what has worked in the past, and what we can learn from it, since it appears that we are in another era of American history where there will need to be a lot of protesting.
I mean, I would argue definitionally every era of American history is an era where we need lots of protesting because it's like fundamentally understood by the people who made the country as something that is necessary for the country to function.
True. I feel like some administrations cause a little more unrest than others. Maybe there was just as much unrest among the Tea Party community when Obama was president, and I just didn't really know about it.
To be fair, like Obama was also doing stuff that I think everyone could have protested, like, bombing a lot of people.
Well, yes. Researching this topic, I have some kind of interesting conclusions after reading about what has been effective and what has caused backlash, because I think those are really important to learn from. For example, Occupy Wall Street, like so many people participated in that. It was all over the country, but it didn't really do anything, right? It was not really an effective movement other than bringing probably more people's attention to something, but we haven't seen any real change, I don't think. In fact, I think wealth disparity has gotten worse. That kind of falls into some of the lessons that I've come across. I'll link to a bunch of stuff on the website because there are some interesting things out there. One of the people that I am going to quote from an article in The Guardian, Gloria J. Brown Marshall, who's a professor of constitutional law at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is part of the City University of New York system, has written a book called A Protest History of the United States, which sounds really interesting. I think I am going to need to read it. According to her, criminalization and violence against protesters have kind of been part of the country for a long time, which obviously is true. During the civil rights movement, leaders were surveilled by the government and jailed. And, at this moment in time, among certain demographics, what is happening now with ICE and the protests and the shootings feels unprecedented. But this has been happening to immigrants and African Americans throughout history. And now it's happening to middle-class white people. So it feels unprecedented, but it's not. But that means we can also learn a lot from looking at the civil rights movement.
I mean, I suppose it's unprecedented in the sense that things that would ordinarily have sort of been enough to turn, and I say little c conservative eye towards what's happening and be like, oh, well, I'm not okay with that now that it's happening to my people, right? Like Renee Good and Alex Preddy is no longer enough to do that there is half of the country that is so locked into this political mentality and this like worship of a political figure that there is evidently nothing anyone can do to change their opinions.
Yeah. Yeah. And, with some of that broader awareness, in like what's been happening in Minnesota, for example, ACLU Minnesota organizer Paul Sullivan says it's also, frankly, kind of had the opposite effect than what ICE and the Trump administration intended, which was, basically intimidation. And it really activated and enraged a lot of our community, Sullivan said. And, there are all these things where like ICE pulls up and all of a sudden, like all of these people just come out with their phones ready and like people are really engaged. So it has been really activating in that setting, which I guess you could argue that they are engaged because people from their own community were killed, but those people were killed because they were engaged, right? This is like a really big engagement of people on behalf of a marginalized group. And so Brown Marshall suggests that organizers today study strategies from the anti-Vietnam protests and civil rights movements to learn what works, including tactics like pressuring corporations to stop cooperating with federal agents. And then Sullivan, the ACLU director, notes that it will be important to fight the securitization that the U.S. government has been ramping up since 9/11 under the banner of anti-terrorism that allows for easy and widespread surveillance of U.S. citizens and other people in the country. So when this has flared up in the past, what has been effective? From Brookings, I found a reference to a 1968 influential article titled Protest as a Political Resource by Professor Michael Lipsky. He compared effective and ineffective movements. And what he argued was that successful movements have clear strategic goals. They use protests to broaden coalitions, seek to enlist more powerful individuals in their cause, and connect expressions of discontent to broader political and electoral mobilization. That is kind of an interesting one with the clear strategic goals, because I think that is something that we see being one of the issues with something like Occupy Wall Street that sort of fizzle out without doing anything significant. Is I think there were a lot of people that were protesting financial inequality and not really having a goal.
Yeah.
Right? There was a lot of, we're angry, so we're going to show up. But there wasn't a nationally coordinated, here's what we're trying to achieve.
Well, and I think that's been one of the critiques of the No Kings protests. Obviously, they've had these huge turnouts, but what are they actually asking for? What are they saying? Okay, well, we'll stop having these giant protests and, saying we hate the government if you do what?
Yeah.
I mean, no kings. Okay, we don't want, but formally, we don't have kings technically anyway. So it's a good rhetorical little thing, but it's not necessarily a clear goal. It doesn't really go anywhere but beyond rhetoric.
I mean, presumably it's mostly like telling Congress to do something. But yeah, that's not.
Do something, please, is not an effective,
right.
Not an effective ask.
Somebody help.
I mean, on the other hand, though, the risk, right, is that you can have really clear, really explicit asks, and that actually ends up alienating people, right? So Black Lives Matter protests, your statement is defund the police and redistribute those funds to other community support options. And everyone just hears defund the police and shuts down and is like, you want crime everywhere. The anti-Israel protests, right? Very clear ceasefire now message, but not getting enough support from, I don't know, the broader population, not having the leverage, I guess, to make that happen.
I feel like there are some marketing issues there too. Like cliche in politics, if you're explaining you're already losing. Defund the police, like we know what that means, but a lot of people don't.
But ceasefire now is not a particularly...
No, that's true. I mean, I think you're always also working against, like in the case of Israel, you're working against a very, very concentrated effort by conservatives to portray that as anti-Semitism.
Yeah, well, and a lot of political money.
And that becomes a really complicated issue. Like that.
I feel like I now need to clarify that I'm not just saying that there are a bunch of powerful Israeli Jews behind the scenes pulling the networks of all the political money. What I mean is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee pours just a crap ton of money into making sure that candidates who are just, a tiny bit critical of Israel don't win elections. I just need to clarify that because of some very real anti-Semitic tropes that do exist. But you can see, though, right, that there's like a tension there, right? Okay, so Black Lives Matter, first of all, also still caused a lot of consternation. But Black Lives Matter, it's straightforward. It doesn't require explanation. Black Lives Matter. Black people are human beings.
Right.
But doesn't necessarily have a clear ask.
Well, and that one was weird because there were some concrete things that were pointed out, that like the systemic racism and kind of differences in opportunities and wages and all of these things that, when it was like politically a good marketing move to get behind, all of these companies like came up with these DEI initiatives, right? And so that's an interesting one because it looked like it was effective. And then there was like this massive backlash and like so many companies have now backed away from that, which I mean has saved me from spending extra money at Target because I don't shop there anymore. But yeah, here are some specific tangible goals that we can reach. And we took steps. And then as soon as the political winds shifted, gone, done. And like it goes both ways too. Like there have been protests in the past, like I read about some of these things that it didn't really look like they necessarily did anything at the time. There wasn't overnight change, but you have to measure a lot of things on like long term as well. Like a lot of the civil rights stuff took some time to make change. So I guess we measure success across a few years. So those things didn't all appear successful when they happened, but were ultimately. And then Black Lives Matter and DEI and all of that looked like it was successful, and long-term looking back was not.
Well, here's an interesting one. Also, that it just has to do with like what perspective you're looking at things with. For last year, I was taking a class on revolutions, like very broadly as an intellectual tradition. And we were talking about like American action against apartheid in South Africa. And, there were a ton of protests where, these protesters were asking the American government to put heavier sanctions on South Africa. And we did put some sanctions on South Africa, and it wasn't like as far as a lot of the protesters were asking for. And so my professor remembered it as being really like disappointing and frustrating that all of these people were so angry that the government hadn't done more. But there was a guy in my class from South Africa who said, no, in South Africa, that's viewed as like a big reason that like the South African government took some of the actions it did to end apartheid.
That is kind of interesting. There's a lot of information you need to measure how these things worked. In my reading about the history of protest in this country, starting from, like the earliest one we really talk about is the Boston Tea Party. A couple of things that have been very effective have involved people sitting in, like Woolworth's counter sit-ins in the civil rights movement ultimately made Woolworths change their policies for, who was allowed to sit where. The bus boycotts, we read about one in the auto industry. In 1936, workers at the General Motors plant in Flint just stopped working, shut the company down, and they just stayed there. And GM tried to force an evacuation. Police tried to cut off their food supply, but they just hung in there. And eventually GM signed an agreement to recognize the union, and workers received raises and were allowed to, for example, speak in the lunchroom. Very effective. It's hard to say if those kinds of things could be effective now. I don't know. For some reason, I feel like that wouldn't be as effective now.
Well, here's the thing. This brings me to maybe my biggest critique of our current protest culture is that all of those protests required people, A, being willing to break the law, and B, putting their bodies on the line. Like, people died. Like, you look at the level of brutality that civil rights protesters were subjected to.
Which also helped, right? Because there were images of that people were horrified by.
Right. And not just one or two people, which we've seen the impact that those have had on some people, at least with Renee Good and Alex Pretty. But yeah, just hundreds of people having, fire hoses sprayed on them and being attacked by dogs and, being thrown in prison and all of these things. And somewhere in the last, 60 years, we have just completely lost that understanding of what protest actually looks like, of what effective protest looks like. And we've got this very kind of romanticized, we go out and hold some signs in front of the courthouse and we have a permit and we're all very polite. And if they ask us to leave, we leave. And that's not what protest looks like when it's effective, in my opinion.
I think there is truth to that. I think that's one of those things that's really difficult to figure out when you are putting together a strategy, because we also have these examples of protests that have backfired.
But I think something that's important to understand is the level of discipline also that are involved in things like civil rights and union strikes. I know most about the civil rights movement, so that's what I'm going to primarily speak to. But they were having trainings where they practiced shoving each other on the ground and shouting racial slurs at each other and not reacting to that. And, they were if you cannot do that, you need to not be here. You need to come up with other ways to support us because we need to maintain this level of dignity and discipline for what we're trying to do to get across, right? And so it is a very, very narrow line to walk, because when you can show videos of people being beat up and just standing there or sitting there not doing anything, that makes them look really sympathetic. As soon as they start fighting back, it becomes an image that can be weaponized against you. And the stupid thing is, you would not ever blame someone for fighting back when they have a dog sicked on them or they're being sprayed with fire water, or, they have someone using the fumigator system inside a restaurant to try to force them out. That's self-defense. And yet, the minute that happens, it can be so damaging to a protest. And it's not something that you can just like send out a little text message like, hey, we're doing a protest, make sure to be nonviolent. Like there was so much effort and so much training that went into making sure that could be maintained.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of effort, and it takes like a really unusually high level of maturity to not respond with, aggression if someone is, again, physically attacking you, shouting slurs at you, throwing things at you.
Right.
Like it's a natural thing to want to respond to.
Media actually isn't a thing that I read about that has changed since the successful protests we've seen, that it is much harder to get the images that, like those images you were talking about in the civil rights movement of people being sprayed with hoses and attacked by dogs. There were like 3 networks that aired the news, and everybody saw those images. And that had a huge impact. And now we have, a million different sources of information. Most people, it seems, just use selective exposure and look for the friendly sources, and that's where they get their news. So they're not going to see those images. There's AI now. Even if you did see those images, it's really easy to convince people that, oh, that's fake. That didn't really happen. It's really easy to frame things by politicians, media companies. Social media allows everybody to spread a narrative really easily instead of everybody seeing documented what really happened there.
Well, and it's very hard to make sure that like corrections to misinformation actually reach people, right? Initially, we were told that Alex Preddy had a gun out. Well, no, it turns out he didn't have a gun out. He had his phone out and he had a concealed carry license. I mean, there are a bunch of people who, will hear he had a gun because that is the information that their networks wanted to propagate, and they'll never hear that he never had the gun out.
Right. So I think we're still in some ways figuring out what works in this setting. You can mobilize much more easily with social media, but it's also not the same as that sort of personal, strong leader drawing people into the movement.
Well, and I maintain also that it undermines those things that did make some previous movements so strong, because again, just shooting out a flyer saying protest at this time, show up with a sign or whatever, does not have the same level of control over what is happening, who is saying what. Have we made sure that these people are prepared? I think that maybe the phrase peaceful protest needs to be eliminated from our vocabulary, because successful protests were not peaceful. The protesters might have been peaceful, but they were not being met with peace. They were being met with violent force, and they were having to respond to that nonviolently, which if you read Nelson Mandela and a lot of nonviolent thinkers, they will tell you that peace and nonviolence are not necessarily the same thing at all.
Right.
So I think we should, that's my hot take for the day. Like, stop saying peaceful protest.
But also be careful, because the things that are consistently ineffective and destructive are setting fires, shutting down highways, destroying property. Those pretty consistently cause public sentiment to really turn against things, even though, like, we know the people going in and setting the fires aren't even like always the protesters, right? They're just like people that want to cause chaos.
But this is another challenge, right? Is also that I also believe that for a movement to be successful, it does have to disrupt things in some way, right?
Yeah.
That, again, civil rights movement, the restaurant you go to for lunch is closed. You can't get into the movie theater because there's a bunch of Black people in line trying to get tickets. All these things that, yes, were nonviolent, but they did disrupt everyday life. And so, again, really fine line. How do you decide what is the disruption that you need? The fundamental idea of protest, right, is an expression of strength to the government, to whatever repressive group you're trying to communicate to, that, hey, we're being nonviolent now, but we don't have to keep being nonviolent. There's more of us than there are of you. By protecting the right to protest in the First Amendment, the hope is that, we don't have to get to that violent place then, that we de-escalate things before violent revolution is necessary. But if you never have that little edge of a threat, then there's no reason to take it seriously. Again, it's just a bunch of people on the lawn who are going to leave when you ask them to leave. So why would you listen to them?
Yeah, I think the disruption versus destruction.
Well, so that's the
is
thing.
the key.
That's the thing, right? Is where do we draw the line, right? Standing in line in a movie theater, most people would not consider destruction. Blocking a highway, it's not destruction, but it makes people really mad.
Right.
Blowing up an AI plant with no one inside, it's destructive. It's not violent, but it is destructive. And how do you find the place along that spectrum that is going to convey the level of strength that you need it to convey without alienating the people you also need to keep on your side.
Yeah. Yeah, it was kind of interesting. I think when you're like blocking highways and emergency vehicles can't get through and stuff like that, like then there's the perception that people can be harmed and that can hurt your cause. But then I also saw, there has been this like controversy over putting in an ICE containment center outside of Detroit and a lot of people protesting it. And then they talked to this one guy that was like, I mean, I don't really care, but if they do it, then there's going to be a bunch of protesters getting in the way when I try to take my kids to school. So I don't want them to do it because of that. And I was like, okay,
Right.
like, I'm not impressed that you don't care about them building like basically a concentration camp here, but like that's effective, right? The idea that if they do this, it's going to cause chaos and I don't want to deal with that. So I oppose this project.
But then again, it brings us back to this idea of like the PR side of things, right? Because also the people who are trying to thwart your goals are going to come up with ways of framing what you're doing as violent and destructive no matter what it is, right? So if a protester throws a brick through a window of a closed building, yeah, they probably shouldn't do that. However, it's not violent. It's just that now some small business owner is going to have to fix their glass, and that really sucks.
I mean, that kind of seems like hurting the wrong people.
I agree. I absolutely agree. So I'm not saying that I support that. What I'm saying is that fundamentally it's still not violent. And yet people frame it as, well, you're trying to ruin people's livelihood. If you have people locking the line at a movie theater, making it impossible for the white people to get into the movie theater, people are going to say, you're trying to put the movie theater out of business. It does not matter whether anybody gets hurt, whether an action is destructive or not. People will come up with a way to say the most hurtful, destructive thing is what happened. And so, again, it's a matter of how do we win the PR side of this conflict?
Yeah. Another thing that I think a lot of us have seen come up in conversation with these No Kings protests is the 3.5% rule, which, if you haven't heard of that, two political scientists, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, researched civil resistance campaigns from 1900 to 2006. And they came up with that number that at that point, when that many people from a community are involved in protest, that is when change happens. And so that's kind of why building organizations that are like cohesive and have a common goal is important, because the goal is to get that many people involved. Whether that number, really holds up over years in the future, like who knows. So Jeremy Pressman, who is a professor of political science at the University of Connecticut, calls this organizational success and says it can be measured by group and an organization's membership funding or even media attention. He says you could have a policy failure and that they didn't adopt a law, but that campaign may have led you to double the size of your organization, so you're more prepared and powerful for your next fight, which kind of goes back to what I was saying about, sometimes it's the long term. This event created more people involved with this organization, so the next time it is more effective, right? So like, just kind of a reminder to keep an eye on like the long game sometimes, which is so hard to do when egregious things are happening, keeping your eye on what we want to do specifically.
Well, and I mean, people have said this looking at, the amount of effort that Democrats have been putting in to try to find candidates who are down with the youths, which has resulted in just a lot of really embarrassing candidates and a really embarrassing. They launched like a Gen Z focused account that's like Kamala HQ _69. And yeah, that misunderstanding what people are looking for. Oh, we're just going to like take this one thing that worked this one time or that we perceive as resonating with people and then dump money into it and put it everywhere and make it all shiny and manufactured is not what resonates with people. What resonates with people is people who naturally engage in that way, who, maybe they aren't super polished, that their TikTok videos aren't that like manufactured, but that are like fun to watch, fun to engage with.
Yeah.
And that's why we see Zohran Mamdani's campaign being so very successful and the people who try to copy Zohran Mamdani without emulating some of those same characteristics being so embarrassing.
Yeah, it has to be organic.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, agreed. So it's just kind of a little outline of protesting and what works and how important it is to have specific goals and communicate those effectively. And, just don't give up because sometimes it is a slow process.
And as I've communicated, I'm not unsympathetic to people feeling like, but you're entitled to react with violence when people are treating you this way. Yes, true. I think you're entitled to act in self-defense if someone is beating you up while you're standing there protesting. But I also think that it's important to think, well, do I want to do what I'm sort of morally entitled to do, or do I want to do what is going to work? What is my goal here? If your goal is just to be in the right and respond to someone who's treating you badly, fine. However, political movements and organizing might not be the right space for you then, because it has to be intentional. It has to be thought through. It cannot just be I as an individual and am entitled to behave in this way because I have the right to defend myself or whatever. That is not you doing what is best for the people you're claiming to be fighting for. And I just think it's important to keep that perspective in mind, because what I see is a lot of people saying, well, people have the right to respond the way that they're going to because they're being treated so badly. Yeah, sure. But is that what is most helpful? Is that what is going to cause change? And I think like what all the examples we've shown here show that it's not what is going to actually get people on your side, make change happen.
Right. I think intentionality is important. What is your long-term goal? Is the thing you're going to do in this moment when your emotions are high going to help the process?
Right. And is this about you? Because there are also a lot, I think, and I say primarily white people because that's the case in my experience. There are a lot of white people who want to show up to a protest and be a hero and do something dramatic. And that's just making it all about you again.
Yeah. Working together with a common goal in mind is the thread sort of all of these successful movements. You have to work together or it doesn't work. Can't be about somebody's personal glory or soundbite or whatever.
Mhm.
Like we have a goal, we're disciplined, we keep our eye on the prize. Now I'm going to just start spitting out cliches. Teamwork makes the dream work. So as always, thoughts about this are welcome. And next episode, we are going to talk about fan fiction, which we have talked about before, but we've been seeing some interesting stuff about this. And I think, it's kind of something that happens when a certain kind of media that isn't usually mainstream becomes mainstream. There's an interest all of a sudden in a world that people have been existing in outside of the mainstream for a long time, often because they haven't felt welcomed in mainstream culture. And then when people get interested in it because something was a huge hit, all of a sudden there's a little bit of friction because that space has been built not out of a desire to be uninclusive, but I think with a feeling of now because our space is cool, you want to come into it.
A little piece of homework, if anyone happens to have the time to binge 4 or 5 seasons of something over the next 2 weeks. If anybody wants to watch Pose, it's an FX show, I believe. It really gets into that, especially in I think the second and third seasons, ball culture in the 80s and how that spilled over into mainstream culture and the way that played out. And I think it will give you a very interesting perspective on the next episode.
So
and I'll give you a gold star or something if you do it.
Take care. If you have a spring break, I hope you have a fun spring break. And we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
If you found this episode interesting, informative, amusing, please review and follow us on your podcasting platform of choice. Getting those reviews and follows really helps us show up more in the algorithm and be able to reach more people to help them. You can find us on social media, Instagram, and Threads at QueerKid qksm.straightmom, Blue Sky at qksm.bsky.social, and Facebook at Queer Kids Straight Mom. We are no longer on Twitter.